But thank you everyone for your patience. We are learning this as we go, and there is a new technological hurdle that we have to learn every time we do this, and hopefully soon we will no longer be doing that. But we are grateful that you're here today with us at the Eastside Freedom Library. We are grateful to be in a partnership with the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Roseville Library on this ongoing History Revealed series. Both the Ramsey County Libraries, the Ramsey County Historical Society, and the Eastside Freedom Library have a lot of events that you can participate in. We are very involved in telling history, telling the story of this place, and also changing the narrative to something that is truer and more useful for us in our day-to-day life. I'm going to hand the podium, so to speak, briefly over to Robin Priestley, who will introduce our guest tonight, Jane Lamm Carroll, with her book, Daybreak Woman. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your patience. We are always thrilled to have you in our physical or virtual space. And with that, I am going to hand things over to Rob.
Thank you, Clarence. And again, I want to reiterate Clarence's thank you for everyone for being patient while we get everything set up. And we are also so honored and pleased to be able to continue this partnership with the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library. It's over 5 years now that we've been presenting these History Revealed programs. This program is being recorded and it will be available up on our Eastside Freedom Library channels and our Ramsey County Historical Society YouTube channels in a few days, probably in the middle of next week or something. I want to again thank those of you who are members of the Ramsey County Historical Society or the Eastside Freedom Library. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to make these programs possible, and there are some wonderful benefits to joining our organizations. The Ramsey County Historical Society has a great quarterly magazine that recently won some awards, and you can find out more about our membership benefits on our website, www.rchs.com, or the Eastside Freedom Library website. So as Clarence mentioned, we have a lot of great programs coming up. We have programs at our historic site, Gibbs Farm. And next Thursday, July 21st, we have a great program with Don Luce, who is was the curator of the Bell Museum. And he will be talking about the new anniversary book that just came out on the Bell Museum. So that will be an online only program. So see our website for more details and the Zoom registration. So just as a reminder, if you can keep your microphones and cameras turned off during the program. As Clarence said, we're working on the technology and I'm going to try not to bog everything down. And you can put your questions and comments in the chat and we'll try to gather those up so that Jane will be able to answer them. So we have a statement that acknowledges this sacred Dakota land, which is very pertinent for tonight's program. Minnesota Mekoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement and how we're doing actionable ways on our website. RCHS is committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community. And we are pleased to bring you tonight's program, which is part of our series in 2022, Making Minnesota, which explores the untold stories, histories, and experiences some of the worldwide immigrant, African-American, and the indigenous communities that make up this, our most diverse county in Minnesota. So I'd like to thank our presenter tonight for her wonderful book, Jane Lamm Carroll. And here's the book, except I don't think it's going to show up for you. Okay. Jane Lamm Carroll is professor of history and women's studies at St. Catherine University and is the contributing author and co-editor of Liberating Sanctuary, 100 Years of Women's Education at the College of St. Catherine. And the book tonight is Daybreak Woman, an Anglo Dakota Life. So if you are interested in her titles, please see our partner Subtext Books at subtextbooks.com. So again, thank you, Jane, for being here tonight. We're very much looking forward to your program. And again, please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about my book. And so what I'm going to do this evening is first read a couple of short excerpts from my introduction to my book, and then talk about who Daybreak Woman was, how I came to write this biography, in other words, why this subject, what was the purpose of the book, what were some of the research and conceptual challenges in the project, and what were some of the most interesting oddities or mysteries that I came across or encountered in doing the research for the book. So let me begin with the excerpt from the introduction. Lake Huron, 1836. The power of the Dakota had always dwelt in the land, from the great forest to the open prairie. Long before the white man ever dreamed of our existence, the Dakota roamed this land. When Beatty was himself. In 1836, Daybreak Woman, Ampawahiayewen to her Dakota kin, Jane Anderson Robertson to her British Canadian relatives, faced a critical juncture. For the first time in her life, she could choose where, with whom, and how she would live. A marriage proposal made these choices possible. Lake Huron. Daybreak Woman was 26 years old. She had lived the first half of her life with her mother, Margaret Ayres, Grey Cloud Woman II, in Minnesota Makoche, the homeland of the Santee Dakota. The second half she had spent with her British Canadian father, Thomas Anderson, on Lake Huron in Canada. Now her father was planning to move, to establish a new Indian agency, taking her stepmother and 4 younger Anderson siblings with him. She could go with them, but at the time she was also being courted by a Scots immigrant, Andrew Robertson, who asked her to marry him. Robertson's proposal presented Daybreak Woman with 2 unprecedented opportunities: a chance to start her own family and the means to return to Minnesota Makoche to reunite with her mother and the Dakota society she had left behind as a girl. She told Andrew she would marry him, but only if he promised to take her home, and he could not refuse her. Her decisions to marry a Scotsman and to return to her mother's people proved pivotal in Daybreak Woman's life, and they are essential to understanding the nature of her cultural identity and standpoint as an Anglo Dakota woman. That she chose to go back to Minnesota Makoche after such a long separation from Dakota society, after spending so many years in a mission school and living as an Anglo-American woman in her father's second family, is evidence of the robust persistence of her Dakota identity, as well as her strong bonds to her mother and grandmother that were integral to that identity. A daughter of the fur trade. Daybreak Woman lived as far east as the eastern shore of Lake Huron in Canada, and as far west as eastern South Dakota. In between, she lived in what are now the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. Her first language was Dakota. Her second was English. She was born in 1810 on the Minnesota River at a trading post, and her life began there because the fur trade had, for many generations, created places along the region's waterways where Euro-Americans and indigenous people came together to trade. Fur trade society comprised people of multiple cultures, indigenous, French, British, and later Euro-Americans, as well as people of mixed European and indigenous ancestors. All right. So now by way of introducing you a little bit more to Daybreak Woman and her life and her experiences, we have some slides I wanted to share with you. Here we go. All right, so the first slide here shows the only known photographic portrait of Daybreak Woman. And Daybreak Woman is the English translation of her formal Dakota name. Her English name, as I said, was Jane Anderson Robertson. And I thought these lines from the Brandon Carlisle song, The Story, were particularly relevant to this photograph and to the subject of this book, because it's so important to tell people's stories, especially the stories of women and indigenous people who have been left out of history. So this is a part of the purpose of this book, or one of the main purposes of the book. This is a map that shows all of the places. I don't know how well you can see it, but you can see in blue, I've indicated all the places that she lived, and you can see that she lived, again, as far east as the eastern edge of Lake Huron, up on Drummond Island, on Mackinaw Island. She lived in Prairie du Chien, which you see is at the juncture of the Wisconsin and
Jane, I apologize. We're not seeing the images on the Zoom. We're just seeing the book cover. So, Clarence, can we?
All right. Do you want me to try advance? Do I need to try to advance this? I'm going to go ahead and reload it. All right. Sorry about that.
Sorry, everybody. We'll get this going. I apologize for interrupting, but
thank you for interrupting. So that
Bailey, again, thank you to Bailey and Clarence for taking care of the technology. We're getting this reloaded.
what if I continue to talk and then when you get it? All right, so they're working on bringing up the slides and we'll get back to those when we can. So let me answer the first question, who is Daybreak Woman? You've already heard a little bit about that from the introduction. But again, she was a daughter of the fur trade. She was born in 1810 on the Minnesota River. She would die not very far from where she was born, even though she lived many different places in between, at the headwaters of the Minnesota River in Browns Valley, Minnesota, in 1904. Her mother was Scots-Dakota herself, Gray Cloud Woman II, also known as Margaret Aird, was the daughter of James Aird, a Scots trader, and her Dakota mother, who was Gray Cloud Woman I. Daybreak Woman's father was Thomas Anderson, an Anglo Canadian trader, and she, as I just said in the introduction, she would go on to marry a Scots immigrant herself. They would come back to Minnesota, Mackinac, and they would have 8 children who would live to adulthood. Of those 8 children, her 2 oldest sons would marry Dakota women. 3 of her other children married mixed heritage people, Anglo Dakota people themselves. Her remaining children one married a Swedish immigrant, one married a Scots immigrant, and one married a Euro-American woman. All of the children of Andrew and Daybreak Woman would wind up living at the end of the century and the early 20th century as well at the Assistant Reservation, also known as the Lake Traverse Reservation in eastern South Dakota. Once Daybreak Woman and Andrew came back to Minnesota Mackinac, they lived on Gray Cloud Island in the Mississippi River. They then lived at Kaposia, little Crow's Village across from early St. Paul. They lived up on the Upper Sioux Reservation and Lower Sioux Reservations on the Minnesota River, which were created after 1851. The Yellow Medicine Agency at the upper and the Redwood Agency at the lower reservation. After the war, after the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, Daybreak Woman moved with her children to Faribault for a few years until they could get back on their feet, and eventually they all moved to the Lake Traverse Reservation, which was created in the early 1870s in eastern South Dakota. Her life was unusual in that, and I have studied a number of Dakota women and relationships with Anglo men and their families. And one way in which her life was very unusual was that she lived with both parents in her early childhood. And then she lived with her mother and her grandparents at Prairie du Chien till she was about 12. And then from the age of 12 till she was 26, she lived up in Canada in various places with her father and her father's second family. So that was very unusual in and of itself, in that most times when Euro men or Anglo men left the region, they abandoned their wives and families, and so it was very unusual that her father sent for them. And in fact, what's really interesting about that family story too is that after the War of 1812, her father refused to live under U.S. rule. He asked Daybreak Woman's mother to come with him back to Canada in 1815, and she refused. She refused to leave her Dakota homeland for her people. But the fact that he actually asked her and wanted her to come back with him was very unusual in itself. I think it's really interesting to see that a matrilineal agency here. So Gray Cloud Woman II, Daybreak Woman's mother, refuses to leave with her husband, and Daybreak Woman herself makes it a condition of her marriage to Andrew Robertson. Because she says, "I'll only marry you if you agree to take me back." And so he winds up following her back to her people. So we have the slides now, all right? Okay, so can everyone can see the slides? All right, so where I left off, this is just a map showing the various places where Daybreak Woman lived in her life that become really important. And she always lived on the water. The rivers and the lakes were the waterways and the transportation routes, of course, of the Dakota people and of the fur trade. And they are the main transportation route really in Minnesota until you get into the late 1860s, 1870s, when railroads finally start to become more numerous. So I'm trying to advance the slide here and it's not happening. Could you just advance it for me? Next slide. All right. Oops. Okay. Let's move on. So second question I wanted to answer tonight was, how did I come to do this research? How did I come to write this biography? Why this subject? So I have, oh, we do have a slide. All right, so this is obviously a watercolor illustration of Prairie du Chien, and Prairie du Chien was a major rendezvous site for the native tribes in the region, and that's one of the reasons why it also becomes a fur trade depot. That was really important as well. This is a photo of the Mackinaw Mission School on Mackinaw Island, which Daybreak Woman actually attended this school for several years, and had some really significant experiences there, and it's where she learned to read and write in English. This is the illustration drawing of Kapoja on the Mississippi River, which is the Dakota village where Daybreak Woman and her family lived. What happens with Andrew Robertson and then eventually Daybreak Woman herself and her children is that they become, because of their kinship and close association with the Dakota, they become important government employees. Andrew Robertson becomes a government farmer and paid to teach the Dakota how to farm. And eventually Daybreak Woman becomes a teacher, and her children, all of them become interpreters as well. These are photographs of the remaining buildings, original buildings built at the Yellowknives and at Redwood agencies on the Minnesota River. These were about warehouses. This is a view of Minnesota Waccamaw with Minnesota River as it, the view from the Yellowknives agency, and Daybreak Woman and her family lived right there. Certainly the landscape looks different now. I'm sure there were probably fewer trees then, but it does give you an idea of the view. This is a map just showing some major important sites in the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, and Daybreak Woman and her family were living very near the Redwood Agency, and a number of them were working at the Redwood Agency when the war broke out, and they got, of course, caught up in the war, and they became captive. This is a very famous photograph, what became one of the most famous photographs nationally. The picture of the refugees, the white refugees from the Yellowknives, from the mission, including a number of Dakota friends of the mission. And you can see the arrow pointing down is meant to identify Sophie Robertson, who was Daybreak Woman's youngest daughter. She was living at the mission and was escaping with these refugees. In fact, I've learned since that time that she was identified incorrectly, and Sophie Robertson is actually the young woman to the right with the shawl and the lighter colored hair and round face. Right in the middle, really, of the photograph, that is Sophie Robertson, Daybreak Woman's youngest daughter. This, of course, is a famous illustration of the mass execution of the Dakota men after the war in December of 1862. This is a Faribault, Minnesota, the junction of the Strait and Cannon rivers. And it's a town where Daybreak Woman and her family went after the Dakota War. By that time, her husband was dead. And they basically went there to try to, they had been wiped out financially, also because of the war, and went there to try to recover and regroup after the war. This is a sign showing the site of the old Sissican Agency, which was replaced at the Lake Traverse Reservation, where the family lived. They lived very close to the Sissican Agency in the last decades of the 19th century. This is the Brown family cabin at Brown's Valley. The Brown family becomes very important because they were also an Anglo Dakota family, and two of Daybreak Woman's, her two youngest children married into the Brown family, and the two families became very closely associated socially and also economically in the late 19th century. This is a photograph of what was the Beaver Falls Town Hall. And Beaver Falls is really a ghost town now. It no longer exists. I went out and searched for it, and in the woods came across the old town hall. The Beaver Falls was the place where Daybreak Woman's youngest daughter and one of her other sons lived, and it was very close to where they had lived at the time that the war broke out. It was a little town that was really dependent on the Minnesota River water transportation, and once the railroad came, the town, gradually died in those towns. This is the picture of St. Mary's Church, St. Mary's Episcopal Church on the Lake Traverse Reservation. Daybreak Woman and her family became very closely associated with the Episcopalian Church, and that proved to be really, very important to their lives and actually their survival after the Dakota War, and it became very important to them on the reservation in the late 19th century. And here in the St. Mary's churchyard is the gravestone at the old Sissican Agency. All right, so those visuals, I think, give you at least a little bit of a sense of the various places she lived and the events that were so important to her and her family's lives. So now I want to get back to the question of how I came to research this book and why this subject. And first of all, as a historian, my project in my career has always been to write inclusive history, to write a history of the past that is complex, that is multicultural, that recognizes cultural complexity, racial complexity, gender complexity. I'm a feminist historian, and so I'm particularly interested in what, using the lens of gender to explore the past and the ways that gender, of course, intersects with race, ethnicity, class, etc. So I wanted to tell a woman's story, and I wanted to tell the history of the region through a woman's story, but I also wanted to tell the story of a Dakota woman and of the Dakota people, because they have been so marginalized and underrepresented in the state's historiography, and also misrepresented and stereotyped. So Now, one of the main purposes of this book is to put the Dakota people back into the center of the story of Minnesota history, and also to correct the assumption in historiography that somehow Dakota people are only relevant to the war, and that after the U.S. Dakota War, they all disappeared. And in fact, that was not the case. Some people never left. Many people, of course, came back, and they also reconstituted in communities surrounding Minnesota. So I came to this particular subject, Jane Anderson Robertson, as a result of doing other work, other research into the lives and relationships between Dakota women and Anglo-American men. And by Anglo, I mean people of British descent in particular, as opposed to, say, French descent, because the French dominated the fur trade. And my question became, well, what happened when the British took over and eventually Euro-Americans took over? What kinds of relationships were established? Were these marriages long-lived? These families, long-lived? And so that's how I got into exploring these relationships and families. I was really interested, especially in the whole question of cultural identity and how people identify as a result of their mixed heritage and also their experiences. Because, so as I was doing this research in these other women and other families, Jane Anderson Robertson's name kept coming up, and I realized that there might be enough material to put together a biography. And I also thought she was a perfect subject for telling her story and her family's story and the story of Dakota, but also being able to tell it in a compelling narrative way, and to use her life as a window into the region's history, because she was born in 1810. She doesn't die until 1904. So her life pretty much spans the 19th century. All right, so that was my preference, or why the book, why this subject. A number of significant research and conceptual challenges in undertaking this project. The number one being, which is the challenge we always find with doing women's history, especially women's history before the end of the 19th century, is lack of sources. Lack of sources about women, but also lack of sources left by women. So that you're working with sources written by men, and men tended to ignore women, or if they did talk about them, they talked about them in particular ways. I have very few sources written in Daybreak Woman's own hand, just a handful of letters, a few letters she wrote as a child in mission school, a handful of short letters as a middle-aged and elderly woman, and one interview that she gave a contemporary historian in the 1880s. Other than that, she did not leave an account. She was literate in both Dakota and English language, and yet she did not leave an account. So most of the sources that I had stuck to me, of course, were those written by men, and of course told from a male point of view. Luckily, the men in her family, her father, her husband, and two of her sons left records that I was able to find and could use. And because the men in her family, various men in her family, turned out to be fairly prominent figures in their communities at various times, or because they were also government employees, there were records available to me because of that. One of the main conceptual challenges writing this biography was to keeping Daybreak Woman's story at the center, given the fact that most of these sources for telling her story were sources that, again, were not written specifically about her and not written by her. And in many cases, she was incidental or marginal, or she was absent. So what I was doing is recreating her life using all of these sources that surrounded her. And it was very important for me and challenging to keep her at the center of the story because of the nature of those sources. I had to make a really conscious effort to do that. And to keep, I thought of it as something akin to painting her back, constantly painting her back into a portrait where she keeps disappearing because of the sources. So being conscious of that, keeping her, and even when being conscious of the fact that she was there, she was experiencing this, these events for this community, even though she wasn't being specifically talked about in the sources. So that takes a conscious effort and a certain amount of imagination to keep doing that. And that was an ongoing challenge. However, I found I was very lucky, even though I had very few sources that she'd written herself in her own hand. They were, the few that I had were scattered across the timeline of her life. And this became really invaluable, especially in the late 19th century, when I had very little information about how she was living, with whom she was living, what she was actually doing on a day-to-day basis, how she was supporting herself, what her family was doing. Those few letters, very short letters that she left, really almost just notes, came at times when I would not have had any other information about her, and they had valuable information in them, even though they were very short. So they became really anchors for me in putting together her story, especially in the last decades of her life. Another challenge was I found when I began writing the book was to keeping her Dakota heritage and identity central and giving it sufficient weight. Again, most of my sources were non-Dakota sources, although I incorporated all the extant available Dakota sources, and I talked about in my introduction how the limits of this book in terms of not having access to all the Dakota history, but there has been a fair amount of it documented. But I decided, as I began writing the manuscript, and I was using her English name, and I decided that that was really obscuring how robust her Dakota identity was, and really her identity as a Dakota woman. And so that was the reason that I decided it was important to use the English translation of the Dakota name throughout the manuscript as to really anchor that for Dakota heritage, to make it obvious, keep it up front. I found that using her English name would have obscured that Dakota identity. And in one last conceptual challenge, I guess you could call it the challenge in terms of my standpoint, would be that, of course, I'm writing this story of a Euro-Indigenous woman in the 19th century as a non-Indigenous woman looking back to the 21st century. And so I want to be transparent, and I am transparent in saying that I don't claim that this is the story from a Dakota point of view. This is one interpretation based on my expertise as a historian, my knowledge of its history, and my educating myself as much as I could, of course, about Dakota culture, history, and language, and having Dakota consultants and relying on information from descendants. But it has limitations. As I said, it doesn't have access to all the oral history. But it is a significant contribution, and this kind of work is everyone's work in terms of rewriting history and making it inclusive, making it more accurate and comprehensive and more complex. It's work that all historians have to do. And so this is my contribution to that effort. All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about were some interesting and fascinating oddities I came across in terms of the research and in terms of sources. You know, that all of these raise questions for me about methodology, how we use sources, how we critique sources, how we rely on sources, and really how we come to write history. So there are three of these I'd like to talk about. The first has to do with what I call the mystery of Thomas Robertson's first wife. And Thomas Robertson was Daybreak Woman's oldest son. And he is the only one in the family who left an account or memoir. And it's a fairly detailed memoir of his life, and especially detailed with the events leading up to and surrounding the Dakota War. So I was fairly far along into the research of the book, thought I had pretty much finished research and was well into the writing when I came across an interview that Thomas Robertson had given in the midst of the war to a newspaper reporter. And in this interview, Thomas Robertson reveals that when the attack on the Redwood Agency occurred, he was at home with his family, his mother and siblings, and his wife. This was stunning to me. I had never seen anything in any record anywhere that suggested that Thomas Robertson had a wife. And it was obvious from this interview that he was married to a Dakota woman. He does not talk about her in his memoir. There is no record anywhere else that I could ever find, or no reference to her. So this tells us a couple of things. First of all, it's an example of how women are silenced in history, that even the women in their own family, in their accounts, men often leave them now. So she is not, he does not talk about it. So this was really interesting. And so what this leads to a mystery, because it's pretty clear from the census at Fort Snelling after the war that she is with them, although they don't write her name. It's listed as 2 in the census. But after that, I don't know if she died at Fort Snelling at the concentration camp, as so many others did, or if she died at Crow Creek, or the reservation where so many others died, to which the Dakota women and children basically were exiled after the war. So that remains a mystery. The second mystery that I encountered, and which raised questions about memory and what we think of its facts, has to do with Daybreak Woman's oldest daughter, Marion, who was in 1870s a widow with 2 small children. She was living with her mother and some of her other siblings on the reservation. And in the every record that I saw that, given by the family, everyone said that she died in 1871. And so wanting to corroborate this, I went through the translations of the obituaries from Dakota Range newspaper from the reservation. I looked in 1871, I couldn't find anything. I kept looking, and finally found her obituary actually was in 1873. So 2 years, she died 2 years after this family date of 1871. And so that raises lots of questions. There's an example, I think, of how a date gets thrown out, a year gets thrown out, and that gets repeated, and that just gets accepted. And it's a little bit odd that the family did not remember the year that she died. But in any case, the other interesting thing this did for me was to make me realize that I had some correspondence from the brother that she was living with. And so I went back several times in this correspondence, trying to find some reference to her death. And they never talk about her death. And I thought, this is really, really odd, or about her sickness. They were able to ascertain why she died. And that was true of a lot of people and Daybreak Woman's family. But in any case, so I thought about this and I kept going through this correspondence and thinking, why doesn't he talk to her? You know, she was living with him. And at one point, he writes a short note about his mother, Daybreak Woman, who was a nurse in the community, and said to Sam Brown, who was writing a note to, "A mother can't come over because she's nursing Minnie. When Minnie feels better, she'll come over." And because she was a nurse in the community, I just thought, well, Minnie must be someone, you know, a neighbor or a child that she's taking care of. And but so this mystery of Marion and when she died and how she died and why it wasn't being taught in correspondence kept bothering me. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, I actually woke up at 2 a.m. and I remembered how it came to the forefront of my subconscious that when 8 years before, I'd gone through the graveyard of Beaver Falls, and Daybreak Woman's youngest daughter had named her oldest daughter Marion after her sister. And on the gravestone in quotation marks was Minnie. And so then I connected it and realized that Minnie was a nickname that they used for Marion. So then I realized that this note that her brother had written saying that Minnie is sick, mother can't come, referred to Marion. Now, nowhere else in any source did I ever see Minnie in connection with Marion. So if I hadn't gone through that graveyard, seen that gravestone, I still would not have been able to connect Marion to Minnie. All right, so the third oddity I wanted to talk about, which also raises questions about memory, has to do with Daybreak Woman's youngest daughter and her son-in-law. In 1879, Daybreak Woman's youngest daughter, Maddie, and her husband, Joe Brown Jr., had their third child in the summer. He writes this beautiful letter to his brother talking about how proud he is. It's a boy, it's healthy, he puts it right on, it's a boy, he's glad he had a second son. He ever had a son and daughter. Goes on and on about his letter about how happy he is. Unfortunately, within 3 months, that baby, as well as his 2-year-old son, as well as his wife, Maddie, would be dead. They all died within a 3-month period. It's not clear what each of them died of, although diphtheria was rampant on reservation, tuberculosis was likely what took Maddie, a great killer at the time of young adults. But in any case, fast forward to 1918, when his father, who in 1879 had been writing about how proud he was of his baby boy, gives a deposition in 1918 about his family and his heirs, and says that the baby was a girl and that she only lived a few hours. In fact, you know, it was a boy, and the boy lived at least several weeks, maybe a month. So that was really stunning to me. And of course, the deposition is 1918, right? So many decades later, he's quite an old man by this time. But the fact that he did not remember that it had been a boy and how proud he had been, and raised just lots of questions for me about, you know, if I had not seen that 1879 letter, I'd taken the 1918 deposition to be the fact, right? Memories changed, and he was, of course, traumatized after those 3 months of losing the baby, the toddler, and then his wife, and of course the 3 months, and so all kinds of things can happen, but raised lots of questions for me about memory and what we rely on, you know, reliable sources. So I'm sure that there are people with questions, and I'm going to stop now and open it up to anyone who has questions they want to have.
Thank you, Jane. This is a great presentation. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will read them out for Jane to answer. And I'm not seeing any yet, but we will in a minute. Also, if you'd like, I believe that we can turn on people's microphones if you'd like to share as well, but please keep your cameras off. While we're waiting, oh, here we go. How did Daybreak Woman come to be such a prominent figure for you personally? You touched on it, but maybe a little bit more.
Well, as I said, I have been doing research and her name kept coming up, and her, because she and her family were so closely associated with the Dakota and the those major events. And as I said, because the men in her family were employed by the government, she herself was employed by the government at Capozia and at both the upper and lower Sioux agencies. And I came to realize that, you know, she lived a long life, that there probably were enough sources around, at least surrounding her, that I could put something together. And I thought what I knew of her story was really fascinating, and I thought her life could be a really important way of, as I said, providing a window into the social history of the region, but also from a woman's point of view, the Indigenous woman's point of view, and also in a way that would, because of who she was, would exemplify the complexity of our history.
Great. We have two questions that are a little bit related, Jane. So first of all, there was a question from Jana who wanted to hear more about Daybreak Woman's life as a teacher. And then Christy had a question asking about her education.
All right. So her education. In terms of formal education, that does not begin until she goes to the Mackinaw Mission School, which she attended. She goes up to Canada when she's 12, but it's actually some years before her father sends her to the school. And I don't know, I'm guessing, I talk about this in the book, but I'm guessing it might have been, first of all, she had, English was not her first language, so she didn't have English, but also I'm wondering if financially they couldn't afford to send her to the school at first because she had a brother in the school. And also I'm guessing, you know, she's probably very homesick. So, but in any case, she doesn't wind up actually attending the school from the school records. I can tell until she's about 17 and 18. And there it's where she learns how to read and write in English. And then she is employed, her father is an Indian agent for the British government up in Canada, and she's teaching Indigenous girls up on the where her father is stationed in a school there, and that's what she's doing at the time that she meets Andrew Robertson. It isn't I believe until she comes back, as far as I can tell, it wouldn't have been until she comes back to Minnesota Makoche. At that point, she's literate in English. And I think that's the point at which she becomes literate in Dakota, because by that time, the missionaries had developed the English Dakota dictionary, and so when she was working for the government as a teacher, for example, by the time we talked about the on the reservations in the 1850s, she would have been teaching, first of all, the Dakota children to read and write first in Dakota. And then that was the method that was used. And then after that, once they learned that, then English would come next. And so, and then what happens with all of her children was bilingual and also biliterate. So they read and write in both languages. And yeah, I'm not sure. I think I answered the question.
Yeah. Great. And then Laura Jean had a question about, since the book came out in 2020, have you found any other descendants or any more information about her?
I have I've had received emails. Well, probably the most important being the correction of the identity of the daughter. That was probably the most important. Other than that, I haven't received any significant information since the book has come out.
Okay.
The book was published on election day in November 2020, and it was during COVID. And so it's taken some time to find the book, but I'm really, really hoping, that was one of my hopes when I published the book, that I would learn more from descendants, people who had information who read the book. In fact, that had happened for me before I published the book. I got really, really valuable information from descendants who sent me emails with important information that I was able to make the book. And the reason that those emails had come to me was as a result of the other articles I had written, because I had written articles about the press pots and also they're related to. So one of the things I learned in doing this research is that these Euro-Dakota families, especially the Anglo Dakota families, were very much intertwined. They intermarried. So, for example, Miriam, her oldest daughter, married. Her first husband was killed in the Dakota War, but her second husband was born to Prescott. It's actually from one of his descendants that I heard about a really special connection about their son. Yeah, so and then I heard from another descendant, which results in another article I can't, so that's been really valuable in the book, and I'm hoping they go with it.
Yeah, that's always the hope, that people will step forward when we don't have a lot of information about somebody. So thank you for all these questions. And then Mary has another question. We think about the role that the Lutheran and the Catholic Church has played in Minnesota history, but the Episcopal Church gets less attention. Do you know what role that the Episcopal Church may have played in the state's development and its impact on the Native groups? It's kind of a...
Read my book. That the Episcopal Church was really, really important in the 19th century in Minnesota, and particularly important in terms of the Dakota. And you probably heard the name Bishop Whipple, and he was one of the most prominent defenders of the Dakota people, and one of the most prominent advocates. And the Episcopalian church is really, really important to Daybreak Woman and her family. She becomes closely associated with Whipple and missionary Hinman, who is on the reservation. Her son Thomas becomes an interpreter. She allows them to hold services in her home. She actually defects from the Presbyterian church and goes to the Episcopalian. And then in the later years on the Lake Traverse reservation, there's a significant split. And it's a split between the Episcopalians and who side with Gabriel Rendell, who's the chief, who wants to continue traditional Dakota ways, with the exception of becoming farmers. And they split with the Presbyterians and those who want to end traditional Dakota ways. So it's really interesting. The politics of the reservation is very much tied up with this. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that the Episcopalians seem to have been much more flexible. In other words, converting to Christianity, becoming Episcopalian did not necessarily mean that you had to reject your Dakota values. Whereas Presbyterians had to become white, dress like whites, adopt white values. So that was it. And I talk about this book, and it seems to be that's the reason why Episcopalianism seems to appeal to Daybreak Woman much more than Presbyterianism, although for a while, the Episcopalians don't show up on the reservation until the 1860s. Presbyterians have been around for some time, for decades really, but we didn't make much headway, even though they've been around since the 1830s. So the Episcopalians are really, really, I have to say, I'm really impressed with not only Bishop Whipple, but and then Reverend Hinman on the various reservations as well. So that's an important story.
Thank you for explaining that. We're coming up to time. If nobody else has any questions, looks like that's it. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And again, I want to thank everybody at the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library for all their help. Please check out Subtext Books, and Daybreak Woman is at Subtext and you can order it. And again, thank you, Jane. If you want to hold your book up again, just so everybody can see the cover. It's a fascinating book. I very much enjoyed reading it. And as people are saying, it is such an important work to bring this Dakota woman's story to all of us. So, and it's a great read.